Have you ever stood in your backyard at night, looking up at the stars, and felt this strange sense that you're being watched? Not by aliens or ghosts, but by time itself. By the weight of billions of years pressing down on this moment, whispering a question we've never dared to ask out loud. What if we're not the first ones to stand here and wonder? Tonight, we're going to explore an idea so mind-bending it could shatter everything you thought you knew about Earth's history. An idea that scientists whisper about in conferences but rarely discuss in public? What if humans aren't the first intelligent species to call this planet home? I know what you're thinking. This sounds like science fiction, like something out of a movie where archaeologists discover ancient alien technology buried beneath the pyramids. But here's the thing. This isn't about little green men or flying saucers. This is about something far stranger and far more unsettling. This is about the possibility that intelligence has risen on Earth before, perhaps multiple times, and vanished so completely that we forgot it ever existed. My name is Alex, and over the past 6 months, I've been diving deep into one of the most fascinating questions in science. A question that combines geology, paleontology, archaeology, and a healthy dose of intellectual humility. By the end of this series, you'll never look at a fossil, a rock formation, or even your own reflection the same way again. But before we go any further, let me blow your mind with a simple fact. Earth is 4.5 billion years old. Modern humans have existed for roughly 300,000 years. If you compressed Earth's entire history into a single year, humans wouldn't show up until the very last hour of December 31st. Everything we call civilization, everything we've built, every story we've told would happen in the final few minutes before midnight. So here's the uncomfortable question that keeps me awake at night. What happened during all those other hours? All those other days and months and seasons of Earth's year? Were they empty? Lifeless? Just bacteria and simple organisms waiting around for us to finally show up and make things interesting? Or is it possible that in those vast stretches of time, something else awakened? Something that looked at the world with curious eyes, asked questions about the stars, and maybe even built things we can no longer recognize? This idea has a name in scientific circles. It's called the Silurian hypothesis, named after a fictional ancient reptilian species from Doctor Who. But the concept behind it is very real, and it's being taken seriously by researchers who study deep time and planetary evolution. The hypothesis asks a deceptively simple question. If an industrial civilization had existed on Earth millions of years before humans, would we be able to detect it today? And the answer, as we'll discover, is far from certain. Think about this for a moment. We assume that if something intelligent lived before us, we'd find their cities, their tools, their bones scattered across the landscape like breadcrumbs leading back through time. But what if that assumption is wrong? What if intelligence doesn't always leave the kind of traces we expect? Let me paint you a picture. Imagine a civilization that existed 50 million years ago. Not necessarily like ours, not necessarily even recognizable to us, but intelligent nonetheless. They developed language, culture, perhaps even technology. They thrived for thousands, maybe millions of years. And then, for reasons we'll never know, they disappeared. what would be left of them today after 50 million years of earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, erosion, climate change, and continental drift? After the slow grinding of geological forces that reshape the planet's surface like a cosmic recycling machine? The honest answer is probably nothing, or at least nothing we'd easily recognize. You see, Earth doesn't preserve things the way we imagine it does. It's not a museum where artifacts sit safely on shelves, waiting for future archaeologists to discover them. Earth is alive, constantly changing, constantly erasing its own history. Mountains rise and fall, oceans expand and contract, entire continents drift across the globe like massive rafts on a slow-moving sea. The oldest parts of the ocean floor are only about 200 million years old. Everything older than that has been recycled, melted down, and reformed. On land, the forces of erosion work tirelessly to wear away even the hardest stone. Given enough time, even our mightiest skyscrapers would crumble to dust and be scattered by wind and rain. This is where the story gets really interesting because it forces us to confront our own assumptions about as building bigger, stronger, more permanent structures, intelligence, and civilization. We think of progress. We measure success by what we leave behind. But what if that's not how intelligence always works? Consider the octopus. Here's a creature that can solve complex puzzles, use tools, recognize individual humans, and even display what appears to be playful behavior. They're remarkably intelligent by any reasonable measure. Yet they live only a year or two, they don't build cities, and they leave virtually no trace of their existence once they're gone. If octopuses went extinct tomorrow, future scientists might never know how clever they truly were. Now imagine a species of octopus-like creatures that evolved over millions of years to become even more intelligent. Perhaps they developed complex communication systems based on color patterns and body language. Maybe they created underwater societies with their own cultures and traditions. But because they were soft-bodied creatures living in the ocean, and because they didn't build with stone or metal, would they leave any fossils, any evidence at all? Probably not. This brings us to one of the most humbling realizations in all of science. The fossil record, for all its wonder and completeness, represents less than 1% of all the species that have ever lived on Earth. Less than 1%. The other 99% simply vanished without a trace. Their stories lost forever to the relentless march of geological time. And here's what really keeps scientists up at night. There are gaps in the fossil record, massive gaps, periods of millions, sometimes hundreds of millions of years, where we have very little information about what was happening on Earth. Geologists call some of these missing periods fossil deserts, stretches of time where the conditions just weren't right for preservation. But what if something was happening during those quiet periods? What if intelligence arose not once, but multiple times throughout Earth's history? What if we're not the first species to look up at the stars and wonder what's out there, but merely the most recent? The more I researched this topic, the more I realized how much we don't know about our own planet's past. How many assumptions we make based on incomplete information. How easy it would be to miss signs of ancient intelligence if we're not looking for the right things in the right places. And that's just the beginning. Because, as we'll explore in the next part of this series, there are already strange anomalies in the geological record. Objects that don't seem to fit. Patterns that make scientists scratch their heads and quietly wonder if there's more to Earth's story than we've imagined. We'll look at the great extinction events that have repeatedly wiped the slate clean, erasing entire ecosystems and potentially any evidence of civilizations that might have existed. We'll examine the role of the oceans, which cover 70% of our planet's surface and remain largely unexplored. And we'll consider what traces, if any, our own civilization might leave behind if we disappeared tomorrow. But most importantly, we'll grapple with what this possibility means for us. Because if we're not the first intelligent species on Earth, if others have risen and fallen before us, then we might not be as special as we think we are. We might not be the climax of evolution, but simply another chapter in a much longer, much stranger story. This isn't about proving that ancient civilizations existed. It's about opening our minds to possibilities we've never seriously considered. It's about recognizing the vast scales of time that dwarf our brief existence, and it's about approaching the mystery of our own origins with the humility and wonder it deserves. So join me as we dive deeper into this rabbit hole of deep time and forgotten possibilities. Because once you start asking these questions, once you truly grasp how little we know about the 4.5 billion years that came before us, you'll never look at the world the same way again. The journey we're about to take will challenge everything you think you know about intelligence, about civilization, and about our place in the grand sweep of Earth's history. Are you ready to question? Let's start with something that should terrify you, not because it's dangerous, but because of what it reveals about the fragility of everything we think we know. Right now, as you're watching this video, there are cities being swallowed by jungle, ancient temples crumbling back into the earth, entire civilizations disappearing beneath sand dunes and rising seas. And these are places we know about, places that existed just a few thousand years ago, well within the span of recorded human history. The Khmer Empire's capital at Angkor was once home to over 1 million people. Today, most of it lies buried under centuries of vegetation. The Library of Alexandria, repository of ancient knowledge, burned and scattered to the winds. The Indus Valley civilization, with its sophisticated urban planning and mysterious script, vanished so completely that we only rediscovered it in the 1920s. If civilizations from just a few thousand years ago can disappear this thoroughly, what happens to evidence from millions of years ago? This is where our story takes a darker turn. Because when we start looking at the deep geological record, we discover something unsettling. Earth is not just old, it's violent. It's constantly destroying its own history through processes so gradual and relentless that they make even our mightiest monuments look like sandcastles before an incoming tide. Let me walk you through what happens to a city when humans disappear. Scientists have actually studied this using abandoned places like Chernobyl and Detroit. Within just a few decades, roads crack and buckle as plant roots break through asphalt. Buildings collapse as their foundations shift and their support structures corrode. Forests reclaim the land with shocking speed. After 1,000 years, Only the most robust stone structures remain, and even those are heavily damaged by weather and vegetation. After 10,000 years, you might find scattered ruins if you know exactly where to look. After 100,000 years, almost nothing recognizable survives above ground. But that's just the beginning. Because Earth operates on time scales that make 100,000 years look like a blink of an eye. Plate tectonics slowly but inexorably rearrange the continents. Mountain ranges rise and fall. Entire land masses disappear beneath the waves or emerge from the sea floor. The ocean floor itself gets recycled every few 100 million years through a process called subduction, where oceanic plates dive beneath continental plates and melt back into the Earth's mantle. This means that vast swaths of our planet's surface from hundreds of millions of years ago simply no longer exist. They've been literally consumed by the planet itself. On land, erosion works with the patience of geological time to wear away even the hardest granite. The Colorado River carved the Grand Canyon over just a few million years. Imagine what it could do to a city, a monument, or any trace of technological civilization given 10 times, 100 times longer. This is the brutal mathematics of deep time. It doesn't matter how advanced a civilization becomes, how permanent their structures seem, or how confident they are in their legacy. Given enough time, Earth erases everything. But here's where things get really interesting. What if some civilizations understood this? What if they chose to build differently, to live differently, precisely because they recognize the futility of trying to create permanent monuments? Think about the most sophisticated technologies in our modern world. Our computers, our communication networks, our data storage systems, they're all incredibly fragile. A solar storm could wipe out our electrical grid. A few decades without maintenance, and our digital civilization would simply evaporate. Our most advanced achievements are also our most temporary. Now, imagine an intelligent species that took the opposite approach. Instead of building up, they build inward. Instead of reshaping the landscape, they learn to live within its rhythms. Instead of creating permanent structures, they develop technologies based on biology, on renewable materials, on systems that could adapt and evolve rather than simply endure. Such a civilization might be incredibly sophisticated, but it would leave almost no trace in the fossil record. Their cities might be grown rather than built, using modified organisms that would simply decompose when no longer needed. Their tools might be biological, crafted from materials that would return to the earth within decades or centuries of abandonment. To us, looking back through the lens of deep time, they would be invisible. We might walk right over the sites of their greatest cities without ever knowing they had existed. This isn't just speculation. We can see examples of this kind of invisible sophistication in the natural world today. Mycorrhizal networks connect forest ecosystems through vast underground fungal webs that can span continents. These networks share resources, communicate information about threats, and coordinate responses across entire landscapes. They're incredibly complex, arguably more sophisticated than many of our human technologies. Yet they leave virtually no fossil record. What if an intelligent species learned to work with such natural systems rather than against them? What if they developed ways to enhance and direct these networks for their own purposes? They could create continent-spanning communication systems, resource distribution networks, even forms of collective intelligence that we can barely imagine. And when they were gone, all that would remain would be forests and fungal networks that looked entirely natural to our eyes. This possibility forces us to completely reconsider what we mean by intelligence and civilization. We tend to define these concepts based on our own experience, our own path of development. We look for stone tools because that's how we started. We look for metal artifacts because that's how we advanced. We look for cities and monuments because that's what we built. But intelligence doesn't have to follow our trajectory. Evolution is not a ladder leading inevitably toward human-like consciousness. It's more like a vast branching tree with countless different paths toward complexity and awareness. Consider the intelligence we see in dolphins and whales. They have sophisticated social structures, complex communication systems, and demonstrate self-awareness in ways that rival our own capabilities. Yet they build nothing permanent. They alter their environment minimally. If they went extinct tomorrow, future paleontologists might recognize their intelligence only through the study of their brain structures, assuming those fossilized at all. Now, imagine dolphins that evolved over millions of additional years. Imagine them developing even more sophisticated forms of communication, perhaps based on complex acoustic patterns that could encode vast amounts of information. Imagine them creating social structures so advanced that individual pods could coordinate across entire ocean basins. Such a species might possess a form of collective intelligence that far surpasses anything we've achieved, yet they would remain completely invisible to our archaeological methods. They would leave no cities, no tools, no writings, just songs in the deep that we could never learn to understand. This brings us to one of the most profound questions in all of science. How do we search for forms of intelligence that might be completely alien to our own experience? How do we recognize sophistication that doesn't manifest in ways we understand? It's like trying to explain color to someone who's been blind from birth. We lack the conceptual framework to even know what we're looking for. And this is where the story becomes deeply personal. Because if Earth has indeed hosted multiple intelligent species over its long history, if consciousness has arisen and fallen multiple times in forms we can't even imagine, then what does that say about us? Are we unique, the first species to truly understand our place in the universe? Or are we simply the latest iteration in a cycle that has repeated countless times? Are we the climax of evolution, or just another brief experiment in awareness that will eventually fade like all the others? These questions don't have comfortable answers. They challenge our most basic assumptions about progress, about purpose, about our own significance in the grand sweep of cosmic history, but they also offer a strange kind of comfort. Because if intelligence has arisen before, if consciousness is not a unique accident, but a recurring theme in Earth's story, then perhaps it's more resilient than we imagine. Perhaps awareness itself is woven into the very fabric of our planet's evolution. Perhaps we're not alone, and we never have been. We're just separated from our predecessors by the vast gulfs of geological time. In our next exploration, we'll dive even deeper into this mystery. We'll examine the specific evidence that has some scientists quietly wondering if we might not be the first. We'll look at anomalies in the fossil record that don't quite fit our current understanding, and we'll explore what it might mean for our future if the past holds more secrets than we ever imagined. Because once you start seeing Earth's history not as a straight line leading to us, but as a vast spiral of rising and falling consciousness, everything changes. The rocks beneath your feet become not just geology, but archaeology. The silence of deep time becomes not emptiness, but the whisper of forgotten voices. And you begin to realize that the most profound discoveries might not lie in the depths of space, but in the depths of time, buried beneath the thing that haunts me most about this investigation isn't what we might find, it's what we've already missed. Picture this scenario. You're a detective investigating a crime that happened not yesterday, not last year, but 200 million years ago. The scene has been scrubbed clean by rain, wind, and time. The building where it happened has crumbled to dust. The city around it has been swallowed by earthquakes and buried under miles of sediment. Even the continent it sat on has drifted to the other side of the planet. How would you even begin to solve that case? This is the challenge facing scientists who study what they call deep time archaeology. And the more they look, the more they realize we might be missing entire chapters of Earth's story. Let me share something that changed how I think about this whole question. Last year, researchers studying ancient rock formations in Australia made a discovery that barely made the news, but should have shaken the scientific world. They found evidence of complex organic chemistry in rocks that are 3.5 billion years old. Not just simple life, but organized, sophisticated molecular structures that suggest something far more advanced than random chemical reactions. Now, the official explanation is that these are just unusual mineral formations, natural processes that happen to look organized. But when I spoke with one of the researchers off the record, he told me something that gave me chills. The patterns are too regular, he said, too intentional. If we found these same structures in rocks from 1 million years ago, we'd be calling them artifacts. But because they're so old, we assume they must be natural. Maybe that assumption is wrong. This is the problem with studying intelligence in deep time. We're looking through a lens shaped by our own brief existence. We expect ancient intelligence to look like our intelligence. We search for metal tools because we use metal tools. We look for stone buildings because we build with stone. But what if intelligence took completely different paths? Consider how life itself has approached the problem of survival over billions of years. The most successful organisms aren't always the biggest or the strongest. They're the most adaptable, the most integrated with their environment. The ones that work with natural systems rather than against them. Bacteria have ruled this planet for 3.5 billion years. They've survived every mass extinction, every climate change, every catastrophe that wiped out larger, more complex organisms. They did it not by building monuments or cities, but by becoming invisible, flexible, essential. What if intelligence learned the same lesson? I want you to imagine a species that evolved not on land, but in the deep ocean. Water covers 70% of our planet's surface, yet we've explored less than 5% of it. The ocean floor contains mountain ranges taller than the Himalayas, canyons deeper than the Grand Canyon, and ecosystems we're only beginning to understand. In the deepest parts of the ocean, pressure creates conditions we can barely comprehend. Water becomes almost solid. Chemistry works differently. Life finds ways to exist that seem impossible by surface standards. Now imagine intelligence emerging in that environment. Not human-like intelligence, but something adapted to three-dimensional thinking, to pressure-based communication, to living in perfect darkness, where the only light comes from bioluminescence. Such beings might develop technologies based on controlled chemistry rather than controlled fire. They might create tools from living organisms rather than dead materials. They might build cities that grow rather than being constructed, using coral-like organisms that could be shaped and directed, but would appear completely natural to surface dwellers. When these civilizations ended, either through extinction or evolution into something else entirely, their cities would simply die and decay back into the ocean floor. Within a few million years, they'd be indistinguishable from natural reef systems. We would never know they had existed. This isn't pure speculation. We're already discovering that ocean life is far more sophisticated than we previously imagined. Whales have been found to have dialects that change over generations, suggesting cultural transmission of information. Octopuses create tools and solve problems that would challenge human children. Some species of fish engage in what can only be described as agriculture, carefully tending gardens of algae. But here's what really keeps me awake at night. We're finding these behaviors in species that evolved relatively recently. What about the species that had hundreds of millions of years to develop even more sophisticated behaviors? The fossil record from the oceans is even more incomplete than the land record. Soft-bodied creatures rarely fossilize. The ocean floor gets recycled through plate tectonics. Entire ecosystems can vanish without leaving any trace. If aquatic intelligence evolved and disappeared during any of the major gaps in the fossil record, we would have no way of knowing. But the ocean isn't the only place where intelligence might hide from our archaeological methods. Consider the possibility of intelligence that operated on completely different timescales than our own. We think in terms of years, decades, maybe centuries, if we're planning really far ahead. But what about intelligence that thought in terms of millennia, species that lived for thousands of years and planned across geological timescales? Such beings might create changes so gradual that they would appear natural to us. They might guide evolution itself, carefully nudging species toward desired outcomes over millions of years. They might terraform entire continents through processes so slow and subtle that we would mistake their engineering for natural climate change. The end result might be a planet shaped by intelligence, but intelligence so patient and far-seeing that it left no obvious fingerprints. Just landscapes that seem a little too perfect, ecosystems that are a little too balanced, evolutionary paths that are a little too elegant to be purely random. We might be living on a world that was designed, but designed so skillfully that the design is invisible. This brings us to one of the most disturbing possibilities of all. What if intelligence has evolved multiple times on Earth, but it keeps reaching the same dead end? What if there's something about the development of complex consciousness that leads inevitably to extinction? Think about our own trajectory. In just a few centuries, we've gone from burning wood for energy to splitting atoms. We've created technologies that could either take us to the stars or destroy our entire civilization. We're conducting a planetary scale experiment with our atmosphere and climate, and we're not entirely sure how it's going to turn out. Maybe every intelligent species faces these same crossroads. Maybe consciousness itself contains the seeds of its own destruction. Maybe intelligence naturally leads to technologies that become too powerful to control, or to population growth that exceeds environmental limits, or to social complexities that eventually collapse under their own weight. If that's true, then Earth might be littered with the invisible remains of civilizations that rose, flourished briefly, and then vanished when they hit the same barriers we're approaching now. The fossil record already shows us that complex life has faced multiple mass extinctions. The Permian extinction wiped out 90% of all species. The Cretaceous extinction ended the age of dinosaurs. There have been at least 5 major extinction events and dozens of smaller ones. Each time, life recovered and evolved in new directions. But what if some of those extinctions weren't caused by asteroids or volcanoes? What if they were caused by intelligence reaching its limits and taking large portions of the ecosystem down with it? We might not be the first species to face the challenges of nuclear weapons, climate change, or resource depletion. We might just be the first to face them with enough technological capability to potentially leave traces that future species could recognize. But even that assumes future species would know what to look for. If our civilization collapsed tomorrow, what would remain after 1,000,000 years? Our plastics would eventually break down. Our metals would corrode. Our cities would crumble. Our nuclear waste might leave isotopic signatures in rock formations, but only a future geologists knew to look for them and understood what they meant. Most likely, we'd leave behind the same thing all our potential predecessors left behind. Nothing, just another mysterious gap in the fossil record. Just another layer of sediment with an unusual chemical composition that future scientists would explain away as natural processes they don't quite understand yet. This possibility should humble us. It should make us question our assumptions about progress, about permanence, about our own significance in the grand sweep of Earth's history. But it should also inspire us. Because if intelligence has evolved before, if consciousness is not a unique accident, but a recurring feature of Earth's story, then perhaps it's more resilient than we imagine. Perhaps awareness itself is woven into the very fabric of our planet's evolution. Perhaps we're not alone, and we never have been. We're just separated from our predecessors by the vast gulfs of geological time. In our next exploration, we'll examine the specific evidence that has some scientists quietly wondering about these possibilities. We'll look at anomalies that don't quite fit our current understanding of Earth's history, and we'll grapple with what it might mean for our future if the past holds more mysteries than we ever dared to imagine. Because once you start seeing Earth's history not as a straight line leading to us, but as a vast cycle of rising and falling consciousness, everything changes. The ground beneath your feet becomes not just geology, but archaeology. The silence of ancient rocks becomes not emptiness, but the whisper of forgotten voices. And you begin to wonder if the most profound discoveries about intelligence in the universe might not require telescopes pointed at distant stars, but microscopes pointed at the stones in our own. The strangest part of this entire investigation isn't the possibility that other intelligences existed before us. It's how desperately we want to believe we're special. I've been thinking about this for months now, and I keep coming back to the same uncomfortable realization. We've built our entire understanding of intelligence around ourselves. We've made ourselves the gold standard, the measuring stick, the end goal of 4 billion years of evolution. But what if that's just narcissism dressed up as science? Let me tell you about a conversation I had with Dr. Sarah Chin, a paleobiologist who studies extinction patterns. We were discussing the gaps in the fossil record when she said something that stopped me cold. You know what bothers me most about the missing evidence problem? It's not that we can't find traces of ancient intelligence. It's that we wouldn't recognize them if we did find them. We're looking for ourselves in the rocks, and that might be the biggest mistake in the history of science. Think about what that means. Right now, there could be evidence of ancient intelligence sitting in museum drawers around the world labeled as unusual geological formation or unknown natural process. There could be patterns in rock layers that we've been staring at for decades, never realizing we're looking at the remains of technologies so different from ours that we can't even conceive of them. This is where our journey takes a truly unsettling turn. Because if we start questioning our assumptions about what intelligence looks like, we have to start questioning everything else too. What counts as technology? What counts as civilization? What counts as leaving a trace? We assume intelligence means tools. But what if intelligence means something entirely different? What if the highest form of consciousness isn't building things, but learning to live without building anything at all? Consider the possibility that advanced intelligence might actually be invisible by design, not because these species were primitive, but because they were so sophisticated they understood something we haven't figured out yet. That the mark of true intelligence isn't dominion over nature, but harmony with it. Imagine a species that evolved for millions of years longer than we have. They went through their own industrial revolution, their own technological explosion, their own crisis of sustainability. But instead of destroying themselves or their environment, they found a different path. They learned to work with biological systems rather than replacing them. They developed what we might call living technology that grew, adapted, and evolved alongside them. Their cities might have been forests and shaped over that they guide thousands of years. Their communication networks might have been root systems and fungal networks spanning continents. Their transportation might have been modified organisms that carried them through air and water with perfect efficiency. To us, looking back through geological time, their world would look completely natural. We might even admire the pristine wilderness they left behind, never knowing we were walking through the carefully tended garden of a civilization that lasted longer than we can imagine. But here's what really makes my skin crawl. What if they're still here? Not as individuals, obviously, but what if some of the natural systems we think we understand are actually the descendants of their technologies? What if some of the ecological processes we study are still carrying out functions they were designed to perform millions of years ago? We know that evolution can preserve information across vast time scales. DNA carries instructions that have been refined over billions of years. Instincts guide behavior in ways that seem almost magical. What if some of these systems aren't just products of random evolution, but the fossilized remains of ancient engineering? What if the migration patterns of whales follow routes that were established by intelligence we can't recognize? What if the seasonal cycles of forests are partially guided by regulatory mechanisms that have been running automatically since long before humans existed? We might be living inside a machine so sophisticated that we mistake it for nature us to completely wreck. This possibility forces inside our itself, relationship with the planet. We think of ourselves as separate from nature, as observers studying a world that exists independently of consciousness. But what if consciousness has been shaping this world for far longer than we realize? What if intelligence and nature have been co-evolving for hundreds of millions of years? And that brings us to the most terrifying question of all. If previous intelligences did exist, and if they did find ways to live sustainably for millions of years, why aren't they still here? There are only a few possibilities, and none of them are comfortable to think about. Maybe they evolved beyond physical form entirely, transcending into something we can't perceive or understand. Maybe they left the planet, spreading to other worlds when Earth could no longer contain their growth. Maybe they deliberately chose extinction, recognizing that even the most sustainable civilization eventually reaches limits that can only be solved by ending. Or maybe they're waiting. Maybe they're watching us right now, these descendants of ancient intelligence, waiting to see if we'll make the same choices they did. Waiting to see if we'll learn to live within the systems they established, or if we'll destroy ourselves trying to replace them with our own crude technologies. Maybe the climate changes we're experiencing aren't just the result of our industrial emissions. Maybe they're the planet's immune system responding to a new infection. Maybe Earth has been through this before, with other species that thought they could reshape the world to suit their needs. And maybe it has learned how to defend itself. I know how paranoid this sounds. I know how easily these ideas slide from scientific speculation into conspiracy theory territory. But the more I research deep time and the possibility of ancient intelligence, the more I realize how little we actually understand about the world we live in. We think we're the first species to develop global communication networks, but mycorrhizal fungi have been sharing information across continents for hundreds of millions of years. We think we invented agriculture, but we're discovering that countless species have been deliberately cultivating other organisms for far longer than we have. We think we're the first to alter the composition of Earth's atmosphere, but cyanobacteria did that billions of years ago, and somehow life survived and adapted. Maybe our entire concept of being first is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of how intelligence works on geological timescales. And maybe that misunderstanding is about to cost us everything. Because if we are following a pattern that's been repeated before, if intelligence naturally leads to crisis points that most species can't navigate, then we're approaching the same test that our predecessors faced. The same moment of choice between sustainability and collapse. The difference is that we might be the first species to face this test with enough awareness to actually understand what's happening. We might be the first to recognize the pattern and choose a different path, but only if we're willing to let go of our assumptions about what intelligence means and what our role in Earth's story really is. Only if we're humble enough to admit that we might not be the pinnacle of evolution, but just another experiment in consciousness that could easily fail, only if we're wise enough to learn from the silence of those who came before us. In our next exploration, we'll dive deeper into the specific evidence that suggests we might not be alone in Earth's history. We'll examine anomalies that have been puzzling scientists for decades. We'll look at patterns that might be more than just coincidences. And we'll confront the ultimate question that this investigation has been building toward. If we're not the first intelligent species on Earth, and if our predecessors found ways to survive and thrive for millions of years, what can we learn from them before it's too late? Because time is running out for us to figure this out. The same forces that erased previous intelligences from the fossil record are already at work on us. Climate change, resource depletion, social collapse, technological risks we can barely comprehend. We have maybe decades, maybe centuries, to prove that intelligence can be something more than just another evolutionary dead end. To show that consciousness can be a force for creation rather than destruction. To demonstrate that we learned something from the whispers of deep time. The clock is ticking, and the rocks are watching, and somewhere in the silence between what we know and what we fear, the answer is waiting for us to be brave enough to find. The evidence starts small. A strange mineral formation here, an unusual isotopic signature there, patterns in ancient rock that seem just a little too organized to be completely natural. But when you start connecting the dots, when you step back and look at the bigger picture, something deeply unsettling begins to emerge. Dr. Michael Rodriguez, a geochemist at Stanford, has been studying what he calls chemical anomalies in rock formations dating back hundreds of millions of years. These are layers of sediment that contain concentrations of rare elements that shouldn't exist naturally. Elements that, in our modern world, are only produced by industrial processes. We keep finding these signatures, he told me during a late-night phone call that lasted 3 hours. platinum group metals in configurations that require extremely high temperatures and pressures to create. Rare earth elements clustered in ways that suggest deliberate concentration and refinement. And they're always in layers that date to just before major extinction events. He paused, and I could hear him taking a deep breath. If these same signatures showed up in rocks from the last 1,000 years, we'd immediately recognize them as evidence of advanced metallurgy. But because they're so old, we just catalog them as geological curiosities and move on. This is the pattern that's been haunting me for weeks now. Scientists around the world are finding things that don't quite fit, but instead of questioning our assumptions, we're fitting the evidence to our preconceptions. We're so convinced that complex intelligence is recent and rare that we're literally looking past signs that it might be ancient and recurring. Take the Wolfcamp Formation in Texas. It's a layer of rock from the Permian period, about 250 million years old. Oil companies have been drilling through it for decades, and they've consistently found something strange. Microscopic spheres of nearly pure carbon arranged in geometric patterns that look almost crystalline. The official explanation is that these formed through some unknown chemical process during fossilization. But Dr. Elena Vasquez, a materials scientist who's been studying these formations, has a different theory. These structures are too uniform, too precisely organized, she explained to me. They look exactly like what we'd expect to see from advanced carbon nanotechnology. Microscopic machines designed to manipulate matter at the molecular level. The implications of that statement hit me like a physical blow. Nanotechnology. 250 million years ago, just before the Great Dying, the most severe extinction event in Earth's history. You're suggesting that someone was building molecular machines before the dinosaurs even existed? I asked her. I'm suggesting that we need to be more open-minded about what we're finding, she replied. Because if we're right, if these are technological artifacts, then whoever made them was working with principles we're only just beginning to understand. This brings us to one of the most disturbing aspects of this entire investigation, the timing. Many of these anomalous findings cluster around the major extinction events: the Ordovician extinction, the Devonian extinction, the Permian extinction, the Triassic extinction, the Cretaceous extinction. It's as if intelligence repeatedly arises, reaches some critical threshold, and then triggers its own annihilation along with much of the rest of life on the planet. Dr. James Park, an evolutionary biologist who's been tracking these patterns, put it more bluntly than anyone else I've interviewed. Intelligence might be an evolutionary trap, he told me, a strategy that seems successful in the short term, but inevitably leads to catastrophic failure. We might be watching the same disaster play out over and over again across geological time. The more I learn about these extinction events, the more convinced I become that we're missing something fundamental about their causes. The standard explanations, volcanic eruptions, asteroid impacts, climate change, they all assume that disasters come from outside or from mindless natural processes. But what if some of them came from inside, from intelligence itself? Consider the Anthropocene, the current geological epoch defined by human impact on the planet. We're already causing what many scientists consider the sixth mass extinction. Our industrial processes are altering the chemistry of the atmosphere and oceans. Our technologies are creating new materials that will persist in the geological record for millions of years. Future geologists will be able to identify the moment when human intelligence emerged not by our bones or our tools, but by the sudden appearance of plastics, concrete, and radioactive isotopes in sediment layers around the world. We're leaving a signature that will be visible for tens of millions of years. But what if we're not the first species to leave such a signature? What if some of those ancient chemical anomalies aren't geological curiosities, but the fossilized remains of previous Anthropocenes? Previous moments when intelligence reached the point where it could reshape the planet's chemistry. The thought keeps me awake at night. Because if that's true, if intelligence has repeatedly emerged and repeatedly caused mass extinctions, then we're not just studying ancient history, we're studying our own future. Dr. Lisa Morgan, a paleoclimatologist who's been analyzing ice core data from Antarctica, showed me something that made my blood run cold. Deep in the ice, in layers that date back millions of years, she's found chemical signatures that match the pollution patterns we're creating today. Not identical, but similar enough to suggest industrial activity. It's probably nothing, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. There are natural processes that could explain these signatures: volcanic activity, unusual weather patterns. But the concentrations are so high and they appear so suddenly in the record. It's almost like someone turned on a massive industrial civilization and then turned it off again within just a few thousand years. A few thousand years. That's nothing in geological time. A civilization could rise, flourish, reshape the planet's atmosphere, and then collapse so completely that only these faint chemical traces remain. And if it happened more than a few million years ago, even those traces would be nearly impossible to detect. We're essentially trying to solve a crime where the evidence has been weathered, buried, scattered, and recycled by geological processes for longer than we can truly comprehend. It's like trying to reconstruct a conversation by analyzing the echoes in an empty auditorium centuries after the words were spoken. But the echoes are there, faint, distorted, barely detectable, but real. Dr. Amanda Foster, an archaeologist who's been applying new dating techniques to controversial artifacts, has been finding objects in geological contexts that seem impossible by conventional chronology. Stone tools in coal seams, metal objects embedded in rock formations millions of years old, structures that appear artificial in layers that predate known civilization by vast margins. The problem isn't finding anomalous artifacts, she told me. The problem is that when we do find them, the scientific community has no framework for interpreting them. So they get dismissed, filed away, forgotten. We have drawers full of impossible objects that nobody wants to talk about. She showed me photographs of some of these artifacts. a metallic sphere found in a South African mine, embedded in rock that's 3 billion years old. Grooves carved into the sphere's surface with mathematical precision. A hammer-like object found in Texas, encased in stone, that supposedly formed 100 million years before humans existed. Spiral metal objects discovered in Russia, so small they can only be seen under a microscope, but showing clear signs of artificial construction. Any one of these could be explained away. Dating errors, contamination, natural processes that mimic artificial construction, but taken together, they suggest a pattern that's deeply uncomfortable for our understanding of Earth's history. What if we've been wrong about everything? Dr. Foster asked me. What if intelligence has been arising and disappearing for hundreds of millions of years, and we've just been too proud to admit we might not be the first? The question hung in the air between us, heavy with implications that neither of us wanted to fully confront. Because if we're not the first, if intelligence has been cycling through rise and collapse for geological ages, then what does that say about our own future? Are we doomed to repeat the same pattern? Are we already repeating it? The signs are certainly there. Climate change accelerating beyond our ability to control it. Technological risks multiplying faster than our wisdom to manage them. Social and economic systems becoming so complex that they're starting to collapse under their own weight. Maybe this is what the end always looks like. Not a sudden catastrophe, but a gradual loss of control as intelligence creates problems it can't solve, changes it can't reverse, consequences it can't escape. Maybe the silence in the fossil record isn't empty at all. Maybe it's full of civilizations that reached exactly where we are now, looked into the same abyss we're staring into, and couldn't find a way back. But there's another possibility, one that's even more disturbing to consider. What if some of them did find a way back? What if intelligence occasionally manages to navigate the crisis, to find sustainable ways of existing that can persist for geological timescales? What if the planet is still shaped by the descendants of those successful civilizations, but in ways so subtle and sophisticated that we can't recognize them? What if we're not alone on Earth right now, but we're too young and crude to perceive the intelligence that surrounds us? That possibility changes everything. Because if there are still traces of ancient intelligence active in Earth's systems, if some of our predecessors found ways to integrate with the planet rather than dominating it, then maybe we're not facing this crisis alone. Maybe there are teachers all around us, waiting for us to become wise enough to recognize them. Maybe the path forward has already been mapped by those who walked it millions of years before we were even a possibility. But first, we have to let go of our assumption that we're the pinnacle of Earth's story. We have to become humble enough to admit that we might be students rather than masters, children rather than adults, in the long conversation between intelligence and the living world. The evidence is mounting. The patterns are becoming clear. The question is no longer whether intelligence existed before us. The question is whether we're mature enough to learn from what it left behind, and whether we have enough time to figure it out before we become just another layer of chemical anomalies for the next species to puzzle over in the rocks. The silence is getting louder. That's the thought that keeps echoing in my mind as I sift through more evidence, more testimonies, more fragments of a puzzle that seems to grow larger the more pieces we find. Because the absence of something isn't always proof that it never existed. Sometimes silence is the loudest scream of all. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a microbiologist at the University of Colorado, contacted me after watching the first part of this series. What she told me changed the entire direction of my investigation. She's been studying extremophile bacteria, organisms that live in conditions so harsh they shouldn't exist at all. Boiling acid springs, the depths of ice sheets, inside solid rock kilometers beneath the surface. These organisms aren't just surviving in impossible conditions, she explained during our video call. They're thriving. And some of them are doing things that look almost intentional. Building structures, coordinating behavior across vast distances, responding to environmental changes in ways that seem too sophisticated for simple bacteria. She pulled up microscopic images on her screen, bacterial colonies arranged in perfect geometric patterns, spirals and hexagons and complex networks that looked more like circuit boards than biological communities. This colony has been growing in the same hot spring for what we estimate to be over 10,000 years, she said, pointing to one particularly intricate formation. It's been maintaining these patterns, rebuilding them when they're damaged, even expanding them in response to seasonal changes. It's like they're following some kind of blueprint. The implications hit me immediately. If bacteria can maintain complex, organized structures for thousands of years, what could more advanced organisms accomplish given millions of years to develop? What if intelligence doesn't always mean big brains and opposable thumbs? What if it can emerge from collective behavior, from systems that span entire ecosystems? You're talking about distributed intelligence, I said, like a planetary nervous system. Exactly. And here's what really keeps me up at night. These bacterial networks show signs of information storage and retrieval. They can remember environmental conditions from decades ago and adjust their behavior accordingly. They're essentially biological computers that have been running continuously for longer than recorded human history. This conversation opened a door I hadn't even known existed, because if microscopic organisms can form intelligent networks that persist for millennia, what's stopping larger, more complex systems from doing the same thing on even grander scales? I started reaching out to mycologists, scientists who study fungi.